Welcome back to This Is Your Country with Paige Willey. Today, I am so excited to have on as a guest my friend Pedro Gonzalez, who is a senior writer and associate editor at Chronicles Magazine. He has been delving into a number of really important issues, including crime and immigration and the evolution of the populist right. He's incredibly knowledgeable, so I'm so excited to have him on. Pedro, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me, Paige. I appreciate it.
Of course. So the first issue I want to get into is pertaining to immigration. And we hear a lot of talk about protecting democracy and a lot of back and forth about how Republicans always want to threaten basically the franchise of voters to have their voices heard. That is a huge talking point that we have heard from Joe Biden to the Major League Baseball organization. Basically, any attempt by voters to protect the franchise or protect how their voices are heard on certain issues is interpreted in the mainstream media as a threat to quote unquote democracy. But I want to drill down on a specific issue that I regard as one of the worst actual threats to the capacity for voters to have their voices heard, threats to the will of the people, and that is the instance of Proposition 187 in California. So this was an issue where there was a tremendous amount of institutional power working against the voters when they demanded what amounted to immigration restrictionism. There was a period of time, this was in 1994 in California, when the illegal immigration issue had become so serious that they needed to control the burden on public services statewide. And that is what voters chose to do. This proposition that would establish a state-run citizenship screening system and prohibit illegal immigrants from using non-emergency healthcare, public education, and other services in the state of California. It was passed by voters via referendum in 1994 with 58% of the vote. You have written about this issue and about other institutional attempts to sort of quash the effect that this choice by voters would have. Can you walk us through Proposition 187 and what happened in that era when voters in California chose to limit the services that illegal immigrants were entitled to, and then and by sort of implication, reduce the incentive for illegal immigration in that state?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think one of the most interesting things I found, because it's so just politically incorrect these days, was digging into the archives of the LA Times and looking back at just local news reports about the ongoings of different schools in the Los Angeles area. And what I found was a few clippings about basically race riots. And in some cases, Black students who were interviewed by the LA Times would say quite explicitly that we feel like we're being replaced. It's an interesting term, right, that they were using to describe what they felt was like their historically Black communities becoming flooded by people who are here illegally, mostly Latinos, obviously. And it's just interesting because we're not supposed to talk about immigration in these terms. But again, just a few decades ago, that is actually how most Americans viewed immigration as a kind of dispossession of the homeland, of our communities and our unique culture and things like that. And I think that to understand 187, you actually have to go back to earlier things, like, for example, Plyler v. Doe, which was a Supreme Court case that essentially obliterated a Texas statute that prohibited K through 12 schools from providing services to people that are brought into the country illegally, and also overturned this statute that for people who were in the state of Texas illegally, that were brought into the country illegally in general, it would have allowed them to attend school if they paid a tuition fee. I think it was $1,000 annually, right? Well, the Supreme Court decided that both of these things are unconstitutional by kind of abstracting the Constitution, suggesting that basically that illegal aliens are people and therefore entitled to constitutional rights. And you can see how kind of silly that argument is, because what we're saying is that the Constitution applies not just to Americans, the people who designed it, the people who built it for their political community, but it applies to all people everywhere, basically abstracting it into just a meaningless document, shredding it, in fact. And when we get to 187, and we're actually, there's another important part of this, but when we get to 187, which was an attempt by the state of California to basically deal with an issue that the federal government had completely failed on, which was mass illegal immigration that resulted in things like race riots at your local high school. The judge who filed a permanent injunction and declared 187 unconstitutional after it passed in a landslide and secured Governor Pete Wilson's reelection and passed with a plurality of support from Latinos. Something like 52% of Asians and African American voters supported it. I mean, the bill was unanimously popular, right? And after it passed, a U.S. district judge named Mariana Faisler deemed it unconstitutional, like I said, and effectively killed it. And to do that, she cited Plyler v. Doe. But in both cases, you basically had states that were actually working through the democratic process, right? I mean, states' rights, local legislatures, things like that, doing what they need to do in order to protect not only state sovereignty, but U.S. sovereignty. And in both cases, well, on one hand, you had this district judge who just decided that the will of millions of Californians was irrelevant and just declared this thing unconstitutional. On the other hand, you have the Supreme Court that said the same thing. In other words, you have to fund the education. You have to provide these benefits and services to people who shouldn't be here in the first place. Although they aren't paying taxes, or if they do, it doesn't make up for the costs that they incur on the general public and things like that. It's just the most transparently, obviously undemocratic way to run a country. But I think this story doesn't really make sense unless you actually also consider another failed piece of legislation called the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act. Are you familiar with this?
Please tell our audience.
Okay. So the IRCA was actually the brainchild of the Senate Commission on Immigration and Refugee Policy, which is created by Carter. And so Reagan comes into office, and there's this agreement that it's one of these things where basically public pressure forces the government to at least virtue signal that it cares about an issue, and this particular issue was immigration. And so Republicans and Democrats put their heads together on this commission to come up with a solution for the mass immigration problem. And after years of jockeying, going back and forth, and it's funny because, again, if you look at these newspaper clippings, like you've got the Washington Post condemning Congress for making too many concessions to big agriculture.
Wow.
As part of this effort to negotiate a compromise on immigration, you've got the Post saying that basically government is making concessions on immigration to the ag lobby. You've got the New York Times saying that if the government doesn't find a solution to mass immigration soon, people will lose their patience with government and perhaps immigration itself. That's the New York Times. And finally, the IRCA passes in '86, and it ends up being a compromise, but it's one of those compromises that you know how this is going to end. The agreement is this: some people get amnesty who are here illegally, and in exchange for the restrictionists, they get basically worksite enforcement, so kind of like E-Verify basically, and more funding for basically securing the border. Only one of those things happened, and you can guess which one it was. But basically, the amnesty part was not only the only part that really survived, it was exploited. Two things happened. The Reagan administration never requested as much money to enforce the IRCA as Congress actually had approved, but we did increase spending for things like defense, of course. Chuck Schumer, of all people, who was a key player in the construction of this bill, actually said that the Reagan administration was killing it by starving it, because it didn't seem like there was any serious effort by the Reagan administration to get the funding that Congress had approved to enforce worksite enforcement. But Schumer, of course, is part of the problem, because his special contribution to the 1986 Act was a provision called SAW, the Special Agricultural Worker provision. And basically, this was part of the amnesty concession. So what it stipulated was if you can prove that you had been in the United States for 90 days between 1985 and 1986, you would be allowed to basically get a path to amnesty, right? So what naturally happens? Well, people who are here illegally or want to come here illegally just go to a farmer, an American farmer. I mean, it's really like a system failure on the level of government, but also on the level of some, frankly, American citizens who took money from people, foreign nationals, to basically just forge letters of attestation. Like it's obviously like false, but all you really had to do was just write like this person was working on my farm during this time frame, and then they would go to the federal government and basically get put on a path to amnesty. And so the amnesty part obviously survived, and it actually incentivized illegal immigration, and the enforcement part died. And in Pete Wilson in 1993, he actually wrote an article for Chronicles Magazine. And in that article, he specifically said the federal government is forcing the states to subsidize illegal immigration. They're forcing taxpayers to pay for this stuff because it has no intention of solving the problem. And in fact, every attempt it has made to solve the problem has actually made the problem worse. I think that's really important to emphasize. The Reagan administration actually exacerbated the problem of illegal immigration by introducing a new incentive. And all 187 was trying to do was to remove the incentive, which was basically free public services. You come here, you can drop your kids off at school. No problem. Well, we take those things away, there's less reason to come here, right? And that was the same thing with the Texas statutes. We don't want to incentivize people basically bringing their kids here and just dropping them off at school and then not paying into the system, right? And then even that other statute where, okay, you can do it, but you have to pay us. You have to actually, carry your weight around here. Unacceptable. We're not even allowed to remove the incentives of mass lawbreaking, essentially. I mean, that's really how you have to think about this, is the federal government was forcing you to incentivize the breaking of federal immigration laws. It's just total bizarro. And we're going to talk about this, but it's like it is the definition of a narco tyranny.
That's right. So
and the last thing I'll say, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, by all means.
The last thing I'll say about 187 is it's become like a byword for political folly, right? Like, oh man, the reason California turned blue is because of 187. It's total nonsense. Like even Gustavo Arellano, who's this very belligerent Hispanic journalist, has written about how 187 initially had even more support from Latinos for obvious reasons. I mean, who wants to live in a country where just like anybody can show up next door, illegally, and just kind of bring their entire culture and community with them, and then just not care to abide by all the laws and rules that the rest of us have to. And that's to say nothing of the economic aspect of it, like the fact that mass immigration, it's completely irrelevant what people, the American Enterprise Institute and the Cato Institute says. Like their job is to convince you that what you're seeing with your eyes is not real. Mass immigration lowers wages, right? That affects everybody, regardless of their race or ethnic category or whatever. And Schwarzenegger, this is another interesting point. Schwarzenegger run his, he supported 187, and yet he won his recall election in 2003. And one of the first things he did after taking office was repealing a bill that was signed into the law by the previous governor that would have given between 1 and 2 million illegal aliens access to driver's licenses. So the idea that 187 was like a death sentence instead of the mass immigration being the death sentence is just totally absurd. It's nonsense that's designed to kind of scare policymakers away from ever trying something like this again.
Right. You're saying that the proposition in California, Proposition 187, which was designed to remove these incentives, designed to protect basically California taxpayers from the usage by illegal immigrants of public services in an uncontrolled, completely unfair way, the fact that they found bureaucratic and various procedural mechanisms to prevent the will of the people after that proposition passed, that is cited as the Republicans in California overstepped, and that's why the GOP has never had any success in California ever since then, because they were going to unfairly punish illegal immigrants, and therefore Hispanic voters can't go for that. Whereas you're saying that is a completely fictionalized version of history, given that evidence about Governor Schwarzenegger working to say you can't give driver's licenses to illegal immigrants, and that was 10 years later. So that was, as you say, you're correcting the record. Just for our listeners who aren't as familiar with the California history there. Okay, this is a really important framing of the issue, which is that illegal immigration and immigration broadly is a topic where the mainstream media and many politicians have successfully framed it as a debate where only one side of the argument has rights and considerations that should be prioritized in public policy, which is other countries' citizens. No. And this becomes a problem because it leads to the exploitation of American citizens who, even when they have for decades made efforts to say, actually, we have rights in our country where we cannot be hopelessly exploited for public services, for job opportunities, for all of these things that other countries' citizens are entitled to when the government protects them in this way. These debates are designed to say, please don't put the focus on the volume, basically the number of immigrants who are coming to the country across all these different programs, whether it's in low-wage agricultural farming wage suppression scheme, whether it's a high-skilled immigration, wage suppression scheme for tech workers, whether no matter what class of immigration it is, legal or illegal. Number one, I've done an episode on this before where you're not allowed to talk about volume because that would sort of expose the unsustainable scope of this public policy problem. Number two, you are not allowed to talk about Americans as though they have rights because immigration is fundamentally a humanitarian imperative. It's a moral crusade. And that is a rhetorical trick designed to prevent discussions just like what you and I are having, where we discuss the downsides to American citizens of subsidizing a lifetime stay in America for other countries' citizens. And so in a way, when voters have no voice, when even you could not be more explicit about it as they were in 1994 with California's Proposition 187. We cannot afford this. We cannot keep subsidizing this. Do not displace the cost of the federal government's immigration program onto the citizens of the different states. These different entities who really want to protect unsustainable mass immigration come in as basically a form of totalitarianism, saying, very cute, adorable vote that you took on limiting the services that other countries' citizens are entitled to, but that is null and void because they have an ambiguous constitutional right to basically anything that we say they do. So I just think that to me, it is an astonishing failure of the Supreme Court as an American institution that when these two cases, or when this instance of Plyler v. Doe came in front of them, they decided other countries' citizens have a universal right to anything that they can claim entitlement to in America, because otherwise it is a form of discrimination. Well, of course you should discriminate against other countries' citizens when your country's citizens are expected to foot the bill. And one topic that one case study that I drill into in a previous episode was that there's a tiny town in Minnesota called Worthington, where it was actually one of the top locations in America that the U.S. government Office of Refugee Resettlement was resettling unaccompanied minors who came across the southern border illegally. And I was thinking, why on earth would they be going to Worthington, Minnesota in such high numbers? Yeah. And then a couple months later, I came across an article about the meat packing plants in Worthington, Minnesota having to shut down because of coronavirus. And I thought, oh my goodness. Are these unaccompanied minors being settled in this town in Minnesota because they are working basically as exploited labor in the agricultural sector? And it turns out they are. And even when the Washington Post was covering this as this deep humanitarian quandary of how these poor, beleaguered illegal immigrant minors were struggling to balance school, and they're working the meatpacking plant at night with their ambiguous relative who was drawing, government money to house them. They managed to portray the townspeople of Worthington, Minnesota, who were saying, please stop sending us other countries' children because we cannot afford the tax increases at our school system anymore.
Yeah.
They managed to cite all these activists saying the only reason why Worthington, Minnesota doesn't want all these unaccompanied illegal immigrant children is their racism. They are clinging to a version of the past that they just need to let go of. And so it is virtually impossible to find a way to give American citizens a voice on this issue every way they try to stand up for themselves, end the exploitation, end the totalitarianism. All of these institutional entities come out in force to deprive them of a voice. And so I just want to go a little bit more into Plyler v. Doe, if you can. You wrote a piece after Roe v. Wade was overturned by the Supreme Court. In the American Conservative, you wrote, it was on which bad decisions the Supreme Court should overturn next. And you wrote a piece, which I will link to, advocating overturn Plyler v. Doe. So can you walk through that case a little more deeply and explain the context and what it would mean for the country if the Supreme Court actually took this on and decided it correctly?
Yeah. We touched on the basics in the beginning, which is basically that the Supreme Court decided that Texas had to provide people admitted into the United States illegally with K through 12 education, and that I think it was a particular school with a policy stipulating a tuition fee for people that are not admitted legally. That was also deemed unconstitutional, basically. And so I think that part is pretty obvious. But I think what's more profound or more important, and what I'm trying to get at in that piece, is the implication that basically the Constitution has been abstracted, or because you use the word humanitarianism, and I think that's actually a really important word, because it's a really bad word, but we don't even think through it. When you frame something as humanitarian, what you're saying is that the thing that you describe as humanitarian is above any other kind of written law. So whether it's federal law or whatever, when you say something is humanitarian, you're saying that other thing it gets subordinated to humanitarianism. Why? Well, because humanitarianism is it's how could anybody oppose that? We're helping humanity, right? And so any laws that you could be argued as somehow like conflicting with that can be either subordinated or at least delegitimized by framing it as like, okay, yeah, you're right, that is a federal law, but it's morally wrong, and therefore we're going to take actions that to justify our open defiance of that. And I think an example of this is like sanctuary cities, right? Just hilariously illegal, the idea of sanctuary cities. But why do we do it? Well, because it's a humanitarian thing to do. It's the morally right thing to do, to just completely openly defy federal immigration law. And I think that word is really important, and we don't think about how dangerous and destructive it is. It also justifies foreign interventions, by the way. Like the Clinton administration. I mean, that was the basis for the Clinton-led NATO bombing former Yugoslavia, was that it was a humanitarian intervention that, okay, killed 500 civilians, and blew up some hospitals, but it was for humanitarianism, so it's fine.
Right.
I think that word is, what's that?
Oh, I was just going to jump in. Go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Well,
you can jump in.
It's important what you say about these moral crusades forcing any sort of legal or any legal consideration to be subordinated to the feel-good moral crusade. And the problem with some of these examples, like Worthington, Minnesota, where it's this tiny town, median income is like in the 20, 30,000s, right? It's like it's not a privileged place. And when you privilege these, I call them ideological abstractions, ideological experiments, which is sort of like, wouldn't it be nice if America could accept every citizen from another country who wants to come to America and live a better life? And then you do not examine the burden that this places on the American people when they have legitimate governance questions that they're responsible for, that these towns and cities, they need to run, they have budgets, they have taxation, they have laws, they need to run a school system. And when you keep flooding it with other countries' citizens saying, well, you have to figure it out because they have a constitutional right to education in this country, it's it's completely offloading the governance question onto areas of the country that are not prepared to solve it. And the federal government is not interested. The activists are not interested in helping them solve these problems. And so it becomes a sort of math problem. If you ran a business like this, it would fail. You cannot make the arithmetic work. And that's what in Plyler v. Doe, this Texas school district was trying to do. They were saying, we have too many children in this country illegally that we are being asked to educate in our schools. And it is a math problem we cannot solve because we're running out of teachers. The teachers don't speak Spanish. There are not enough desks in the schools. The schools are not big enough. We don't have enough bus drivers. Whatever it is, the resources are too scarce to make the glorious sounding humanitarian crusade actually work on paper when the rubber hits the road, when it comes down to brass tacks. And so it's not as glamorous as a moral crusade, but we need to find some way to advocate for citizens who cannot make the experiment work when they are responsible for governance.
Yeah. Well, I think this part I think is actually fairly easy, or at least in my mind it is. And that's by, highlighting the fact that the United States, ostensibly a first world country, has essentially failed states within its borders. Like we have cities and entire communities that are essentially that, right? And when you look at the consequences of the ideology of humanitarianism in the United States as it pertains to immigration, has this actually helped Latinos, the group that it's intended to help? And the answer in my view is no. You have more people in this country who don't speak English than ever before. You've basically created. This is funny because with I think it was Plyler. If it wasn't Plyler, it was with Prop 187. But one of the arguments was, I think it was Plyler. One of the arguments for Plyler was that basically the Supreme Court acted to prevent the creation of an underclass of minorities. That these Texas statutes and policies with education would have created an underclass specifically of immigrants. Well, that happened because of mass immigration. Like we have a gigantic exploitable underclass of people that are basically trapped in poverty, who, you can look at data on things like English language proficiency and mathematics and things like that. Latinos don't really do that well. And this is my controversial take. And I think the progress that you've seen allegedly for this particular group, I think it actually has to do a lot with like grade inflation and lowering standards. Like we've decided things like English and math are racist. At the same time, we've also seen a dramatic increase in high school graduations and things like that. Like it's not hard to figure this out. Like we're just lowering standards to keep up this Potemkin village that mass immigration is actually fine. Not only is it something that we can afford, we can't. It's also a tremendous success. And in fact, it has done exactly what these people said they wanted to avoid. It has created a gigantic underclass of people. And I think that another consequence of that is that people that grow up in that kind of environment are not necessarily going to be patriotic, I don't think. They're probably going to have a kind of resentment towards this country. They're going to feel exploited because they are. Like you said, we literally ship them into like meat packing facilities all over the United States or whatever. Like there was I think in Ohio, I think it was a chicken processing facility where kids were basically being trafficked from the southern border to these farms in Ohio, and they were basically living in like chicken coops and working like 16-hour days. And like that, I think you want to know, like, how do you take back the moral high ground? Highlight that. Like, here is the real consequences of your humanitarianism. A kid living on the floor in a chicken coop covered in chicken feces. Like, that is the consequence of your humanitarianism. To say nothing of what it actually does to Americans and how it suppresses American wages, which pushes people into poverty. And like there are all these ripple effects, right, that immiserate everyone who's touched by it.
That is exactly right. And that's a really important framing of this issue. In a previous episode called The Biden Doctrine, Human Sacrifices for Open Borders, I point out a whole host of these examples where it shows that open borders and mass immigration are not a virtuous thing. The gains accrue to the top. They accrue to the activist organizations that get government contracts to be involved in it. Basically, it's their business model. And the more, the better. The gains accrue to agricultural companies and to other, entities that depend on high volumes of labor that they can use as basically as a wage subsidy to pay people less. And then people wonder, how has inequality gotten so bad in America? Well, because you admit millions of people from other countries who have no rights and who, if you believe in supply and demand at all, it is necessarily going to drive wages down. And so it's creating unlivable conditions for everyone involved. The people who are already here, even recent immigrants who then are outcompeted by another couple million every year that open borders continues. And just to tether this back to the specific cases we were discussing, I just think it's really shocking to me that an institution like the Supreme Court that has their responsibility is to uphold the constitutionality of laws in this country, and instead, and by their interpretation that other countries' citizens have all of these rights under the Constitution because we can't discriminate against them. In a way, while they frame it as this virtuous thing, this wonderful thing, this expansion of rights, it is born out of delusion, and they accept a baseline level of cruelty that they are okay with. They do not mind the burden that this places on localities across the United States to say, we whatever the cost, whatever the downside of this ideological abstraction, it is your responsibility. And no matter how it hurts you in the form of wages, public services, tax increases, subversion of law and order, subversion of our standards as a first world country, when you're dealing with this basically a labor system of indentured servitude and medieval farm labor. Whatever the downsides, you have to find a way to make it work. And I find it hard to believe that was a fundamental mechanism of the Constitution that the Founding Fathers had in mind when they designed our government. So I think that type of broader conversation about immigration and the rights that Americans have when these policies are handed down from on high is going to only become more concrete. And as we pointed out, Plyler v. Doe was decided in 1983 or something. The policy that this Texas school district introduced to try and deal with the burden on public services, that was in 1977. That was almost 50 years ago, right? And so this is not, it's very, very troubling to me when the GOP pretends that immigration is only now becoming an acute issue, and it's only because Biden has relaxed basically the security at the border. They say, we need border security, we need border security. Please unwind the thread 50 years and look at how these institutions that are responsible for the welfare of this nation and upholding the Constitution have been completely subverted to hurt people.
Yeah. No, I think you're asking me to unwind it? Okay.
Oh,
That's
no.
right. Well,
I was using a rhetorical
I
trick
was like,
there.
okay, well, I'll give my shot. I'll give my best shot. No, but you're
I'm asking the GOP to stop pretending with this short-sightedness that this has only become an acute problem under Joe Biden, when in fact it's been boiling under the surface for 50 years.
Yeah. A problem that they've contributed to. I mean, I think I emphasize the Reagan complicity in this for a reason, because we have this kind of mythology of the GOP as being the white knight come to save us from mass immigration. It seems like this happens around midterms all the time, but they have been just as guilty. And I think that's really important to stress that, and in some cases maybe even more so, because Democrats are honest, right? At least today, Democrats are honest about what they want, they're honest about how they view mass immigration as benefiting them politically. And GOP kind of does this song and dance where it's like, we're against Biden's immigration policies, but I mean, they support basically the same thing by a different name. Or they do this whole game where it's like, well, we're for legal immigration. We don't want 1 billion illegals. We want 1 billion legals.
Right.
But it's the same thing. No, I think with Plyler, maybe one way to think of it was the Supreme Court essentially decided that other people have a right to your property, because that's ultimately what we're talking about when we're talking about public services that you pay for with your tax dollars, right? That is essentially what happened. The Supreme Court said, you have to provide these people with basically your money and the things that your money buys, that you're paying taxes uh, to help yourself and your community, will actually other people, specifically people who shouldn't be here, foreign nationals, are entitled to that as well.
Right. And
And I think that's another way of thinking. Go ahead. Sorry.
the framing of restrictionism on illegal immigration and immigration broadly is portrayed as this extremism. How could you possibly contradict America's long history of mass immigration when, in fact, when you look at the authentic implication of these decisions by the Supreme Court and by these other entities that work sort of in favor of other countries' citizens against the national interest, that is a form of extremism to me. And the way you've just put it in those stark terms, that is an intolerable form of extremism, that you are not entitled to basically how your tax dollars are spent, to make sure that they're spent on people who are contributing in your community and so on. But instead, this is foisted from on high. And as I say, it's a form of totalitarianism that nobody voted for. And even when you do vote against it, they nullify it.
Yeah. No, I think a really interesting note here that I haven't really seen anybody else explore, and I've been meaning to look into this deeper myself, is that Christopher Caldwell in Age of Entitlement, really, really good book. He actually noted that another key thing for the Reagan administration to enforcing the 1986 IRCA was that basically enforcing something like E-Verify as strictly as needed to be done and should have been done would have likely come into conflict with like civil rights, like anti-discrimination
Right.
law. And I think that's really interesting to think about that, because conservatives, Republicans, this is like the bleeding edge of where people on the right are thinking right now. But basically, I think there's a growing consensus on the right that actually the civil rights regime is a massive problem, because for various reasons. But in this case, basically, the civil rights regime would have prevented. We don't know, because the Reagan administration was never serious about it. But the implication was that enforcing our borders, right, enforcing our laws, our sovereignty, could have conflicted with the civil rights regime. And I think that's really interesting, because it's kind of an admission that we have basically two orders. We have the formal constitutional order that conservatives. I'm talking about people like you and I, not Marco Rubio and Lindsey Graham, that conservatives believe in and think is still operative, or they want to believe it's operative and can be restored if not. And then you have this other order that is totally unaccountable. That effectively, like the reality is in my view, I agree with Caldwell on this, is that we have actually a kind of managerial order that the civil rights regime is part of, that has effectively repealed the formal constitutional order. We just never. It happened in a way that I think was kind of obviously informal. Like, no one agreed to this, right?
Right.
But it happened, and you see it every time a state tries to pass a law to protect itself, and specifically, I guess in this case, regarding immigration. It comes into conflict with some kind of like civil rights issue, that somehow this is discriminatory, and it is, like you said, but we have to discriminate, actually. So I think this is interesting, and Caldwell is, I think, one of the only people in our time who's kind of pointed in that direction, and I think that's actually where the debate needs to go. So
that's right, and that there comes a threshold that we reach where you cannot reorganize society around the rights of other countries' citizens to come here and be entitled to every public service. Yeah. You cannot run a country that takes as its constituency the entire world. And for the Supreme Court to basically decide that that was the case, and that Americans, they need to find some way to make the budgeting work, it's delusional. And as I say, I believe it's cruelty and it's exploitation, no matter how virtuous you claim the motives. And so a couple other elements of that, where the sort of like the rule of law and the any normal mechanism of governance was totally subverted by this, is that when the California voters passed Proposition 187, again, by like almost 60% of the vote, the quote unquote California Legislative Analyst's Office, which is, they sort of like do these budgetary analyses of how much a particular policy or program would cost. They said the cost of verification, meaning like that's what the proposition was supposed to do, verify that people are citizens before they receive public services. The cost of verification would be greater than any fiscal benefits of the ballot measure. How could you possibly say that with a straight face? That we have ID verification mechanisms for everything, whether you board a plane, whether you register to vote, get your driver's license, whatever. The notion that Americans are not entitled to say, please demonstrate that you are a citizen before you take up a taxpayer-funded service, and you've got an official office of their legislative branch in California saying, no, you don't really want to do that because the cost of that would be greater than their uptake of services that they're taking. And that is something that they use time and again. I remember even more recently, I did a previous episode titled How Big Business Lobbies Support Illegal Immigration. And in Arizona, in 2006, voters had enough of employers hiring illegal immigrants and crowding American citizens out of the workplace and driving down wages. And so the Arizona legislature passed a law, basically E-Verify, saying, like if you are found to be hiring other countries' citizens who are, here in this country illegally, you're on first offense, it's a big fine. On second offense, I think it's another big fine. And then third offense, your business gets shut down or you lose your license to operate your business, whatever. The Arizona Chamber of Commerce started lobbying very, very, very heavily against this bill. And in my opinion, against the will of the people. They wanted to usurp the will of the people and say, no, we have a right to hire other countries' citizens as a form of wage suppression. And a couple arguments that they made were, this is going to be very, very costly to run this type of verification. Are you really sure that you want to do this? And this was such a big problem that was hurting people and suppressing wages, suppressing Americans' employment prospects, that even the Democrat governor, I believe, of Arizona at the time was in a hurry to sign this into law because the pressure was coming from both sides. It was hurting people, and it was not a political crusade. It was not how they portray immigration today as as only the purview of these far-right extremists who are motivated by hatred. It was motivated by normal, average Americans who were sick of being exploited and sick of being asked to compensate businesses basically for all to shoulder the downsides and the costs of their illegal immigration regime.
Yeah, no, it is, like I said, it's really it's entertaining to look at the old newspaper archives and see the way that the discussion has changed so dramatically. The New York Times, I quote this, I wrote a piece on Prop 187 and the 1986 Act for the American Conservative. It's called Restrictionism's Last Stand. And it's kind of a deep dive into a lot of this stuff. But one of the things that I cite in that piece was the fact that the New York Times blasted the failure of the 1986 Act as like the worst immigration fraud that has ever been perpetrated on this country because of the amnesty grift, right? The letters that basically anybody could get. The New York Times blasted it, just said it was shameful, right? It's just incredible how much and how fast things have changed.
Yes, and that they were emphasizing the extent to which Congress had misled the American public, saying, we understand that you take the issue of unsustainable mass immigration and unsustainable illegal immigration. We understand that the public takes this seriously, so we're going to do something. And then it was, as the New York Times, in their own words, it was a fraud on the American public that did not do almost anything to stem the flow.
Yeah, and like you said, like that's the kind of stuff that you only read in like right-wing outlets today. Like the New York Times would never say that because it's just we've just decided that borders and immigration restrictionism are racist. But I think it's changing. I think that basically they've overused the R word, and more people no longer really care. And there's more of a willingness to just do what needs to be done, at least in the base, the actual Republican base. It's not necessarily trickling up to the GOP itself yet. I think we still have got a way to go. But when I hear the level of like frustration from the average Republican voter with immigration, saying like, the average person, not someone like me, I guess. Take that for whatever, however you want to interpret that. But when they say things like we need to deport everyone, everyone who entered the country illegally under Biden, like I think we're at an interesting point where basically the base is far more radicalized than the GOP, and it's kind of just waiting for the GOP to catch up to it.
Right. And people and Americans of all backgrounds are, truthfully, whether they know it or not, they are being deprived of representation in Washington. And so the effort to paint immigration realism as extremist or racist or xenophobic or whatever it is, to me, all you have to do is look at the empirical evidence. This is a policy that is hurting people. It is exploiting people who are in our country illegally. It is exploiting American citizens who are asked to shoulder the burden and shoulder the downsides. It's beneath our country to be running many of our industries on this medieval form of indentured servitude. And as we said earlier, the gains are accruing to a select few. It is making inequality worse. And so we really, by every way you want to slice it, we have the moral high ground on this issue, and it is a problem that the GOP is so compromised by special interests that they cannot represent the national interest effectively on the issue of immigration.
Yeah, this might, I don't know if this might be unpopular with people that are really, really focused on economics, but I actually think that the proper argument on this is the moral one. In other words, if you could prove to me that like immigration is good for the GDP, I still wouldn't care. The GDP is not the same thing as the nation, and I think that it's important that we actually account for the intangibles, whether or not America is actually a country, or if it's just an open air flea market, where the only thing we have in common is eating at the same fast food restaurants and jury duty.
Right.
And I think that's ultimately what is at the heart of the immigration debate. And I think the broader implication of that is that a country that just decides that that's what it is, not really, actually not even a country anymore, just a place on a map, incidentally named the United States of America. I think that kind of a populace is actually much more easy to control and much more compliant. So I think that aspect of this is far more important than merely, obviously we do want to bring the data and crunch the numbers to show that like this stuff is economically bad in the sense that it suppresses wages and it taxes communities. But also for me, the far more important thing is, again, is America actually a country, or is it just
an economic zone?
Port? Yeah, there are people like neoliberals will actually just admit, no, that's what America is. It's an economic zone. Like Matt Iglesias with his book 1 Billion Americans.
Yep.
It's funny because I think that the title should have had Americans in quotation marks. What is an American, right? At that point,
right?
It's just a resident of a pod community. So this is I think the way that we really should be looking at it. And you get it, like the moral aspect of this.
Yes. In my mind, it's both. It's that I find it highly credible and convincing to say that Americans are entitled to have a say in who comes into their country and to control immigration policy just as they would any other policy that you vote on, that Congress has a responsibility to make immigration policy that is in the national interest, not in the interest of just a select few special interests or political activists. But to me, there are a lot of people who are not convinced by that argument. They are not familiar at all with the downsides of immigration because they only have ever been exposed to the argument that it is a humanitarian crusade. It's a moral imperative. Yeah. And so I spend a huge amount of time on the data, basically just as arrows in the quiver, as evidence that this is a policy that hurts people, not in the abstract, in concrete ways. It is making their lives worse. It's actually making our country worse in a sense that when you look on the graph of hourly compensation and productivity and hourly compensation became divorced from each other in about 1975 or early in the 70s, which was just as the pro mass immigration 1965 Immigration Act was taking effect. And so to me, I think a lot of people aren't even familiar with like economics 101, that there are two ways that you can get productivity. One is by increasing labor input, meaning like number of workers doing things or increasing workers' hours. And number two is improving the technology you're working with. So to me, it suggests that we are actually leaving a lot of innovation, progress, and advancement that would be good for our country on the table, because so many employers have been lazy. They're able to rely on the government to just increase the amount of exploitable labor available to them, suppress wages, and that's why you see. And I'll put up the graph on the screen or link to it in the notes for our listeners. You see productivity and compensation being totally divorced from each other for the past about 50 years.
Yeah, no, that's totally right. You're right. And I agree. Like in my own writing and research, I often I bring the data to show how this is how this has negatively affected the American worker and things like that. But I also I just refused to give these people the moral high ground because they don't have it. Like you said, their policies are actually cruel, and they actually lead to real human misery and suffering. And I think that's really important to just rub their nose in it.
Right.
Um,
And
yeah,
to flip the script as a rhetorical tool. I mean, we have to engage in grassroots campaigning. We have to engage in politics as it is typically understood. And a huge part of that is managing public opinion and convincing people and actually campaigning in ways that are convincing. And so the Republican Party has not managed to find a way to talk about immigration that is convincing at all in a way that represents voters and represents the national interest.
yeah.
So I want to turn to one other topic while I have you here, which is that you have also done a lot of writing about crime, and you've done some writing about the topic as it is termed anarcho-tyranny. And I want you to explain that concept, explain where that originated, and it is becoming especially important to our understanding of the issue of crime, because Republicans are galvanized to campaign on the issue of crime right now, as it is just astonishingly worsening everyone's experience in American cities today. It does not matter what city you are in. Chances are that crime has gotten a lot worse. And I have encouraged Republicans not to speak about it simply as broadly crime, because that makes it sound like a person got their purse snatched or their car burgled. But the fact is that this is the result of deliberate policy that privileges some of the most antisocial elements of society to do whatever they want and victimizes innocent people. So, Pedro, explain anarcho-tyranny and explain how we need to be thinking about this issue.
I think you used the term uh, criminal supremacy or something
Systemic
like that.
criminal supremacy.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, that's basically that's the system, right? That describes it very well. So, anarcho-tyranny is a concept coined in the '90s by a late columnist for Chronicles named Samuel T. Francis, and basically he was just looking at this phenomenon where I had this conversation actually with another researcher on crime, because we're still talking about it the same way, and that is, it seems like police are retreating from actually dealing with real, like, violent crime, the kind of stuff that results in murder and rape and so on. Uh, but that doesn't mean we have less policing. Like, we actually seem to have more policing in some ways, but it's just targeting law-abiding citizens. It just seems like the role of law enforcement more and more, and this is to say, this is not an insult directed towards law enforcement generally, towards the people that are actually doing their jobs, but I think it's just indisputable at this point that more and more law enforcement just seems to be geared towards kind of harassing law-abiding citizens. And that is the essence of anarcho-tyranny. Basically, anarchy for the criminal element. They get either free range to do what they want, or a slap on the wrist, and they get a second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and however many chances we can afford these people before they do crimes that are too serious and we have to, lock them up for good. Um, and then on the other hand, you have tyranny for people like us, that the system just seems to kind of target us. And that's not just, like, I'm not just talking about cops and like the FBI, but I mean, even like think about the IRS. It just seems like the purpose of our law enforcement institutions is to just kind of repress American citizens who are just trying to live their lives. And I think you really saw this under two things, BLM and COVID, right? Like, I mean, 2020 really does seem like a nightmare. Like, when you think about it, it's like, did we really allow people to burn down entire communities? And then, like, did New York actually release hundreds of looters who were arrested with basically, a parking ticket? Um, there was an article in The Guardian that did an analysis of people who were arrested during the summer of Floyd, and it found that most of these people had either were either released without. I think most of them were actually released without charges, or very, 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 very light charges. Virtual impunity, in other words, for what has been described as the most destructive riots in modern American history. Axios estimated that it's the insurance claims were between $1 and $2 billion, which I actually think that's actually a low estimate. I think it's much more than that. Yeah, it's much more than that. But the fact that you have Axios saying these are the most destructive riots of modern American history, but then like no one is held accountable for them, right? But then COVID happens, and you've got a mom getting tasered by a police officer for not wearing a mask at an outdoor baseball game. You've got cops rolling Bearcats, these armored vehicles, to shut down bars that like refuse to close in Texas. It's just, I mean, I think it's hard to get a more stark illustration of a narco tyranny than that.
That's right. And I think that anarcho tyranny, it's beyond the mechanics of policing and law enforcement in some ways. To me, it's becoming a broader ethos where you'll have people in these glistening, expensive buildings in San Francisco where they're starting their meetings with land acknowledgements, and they're like policing each other for minor infractions, against ideological thought crime. If you said, I think that he's right about that, and the person says, "Excuse me, I identify as they. How dare you?" And then you get disciplined by your HR department, and you have to do the mea culpa, re-education training and whatever. Yeah. And like they're itemizing every little tiny thought crime infraction that you may experience on a daily basis. Or you left a Yelp review where you said, I had a wonderful time at the fiesta, and someone says, "How dare you use that terminology? You don't have a claim to that, cultural appropriator." And meanwhile, when you're trudging back and forth to your office job in San Francisco, you pass entire alleyways full of people overdosing on the sidewalk, gangrenous limbs falling off of their body because of their fentanyl injection habits, and city workers being employed to bring them clean needles every day under the guise of harm reduction. To me, anarcho-tyranny is an ethos. It's a mindset. And that's one of the biggest things we have to fight in America today is you deserve better. You are being policed for really very minor things. We don't have room anymore for dissent. And even when you make larger demands, like I wish that my elections could be administered in a way where we get results day of instead of 2 weeks later. That would be really nice because we live in a first world country. You are hounded, shout down, even berated and punished in some ways because of this ethos that's taken over that you actually don't deserve better and you need to obey.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. It is, I mean, it is a kind of totalitarianism in the sense that it touches every aspect of life. There is no corner of American life that is not touched by this. Tyranny for the normal person and anarchy for the criminal element. And it doesn't seem like the GOP. I can't think of any politician who's really like thinking about this or talking about it, right? And maybe that kind of makes sense because it's in some sense it is. I mean, how do you deal with that, right? How basically do you deal with an ideology that has completely enveloped society, from not just from policing but also from our interpersonal reactions? It is really something that's unprecedented in this country. And although Sam Francis wrote about it in the 90s, I think we've seen it really come into its full blossoming in our time.
Yes.
In terms of policy, what happens is, I mean, like, you can name your victim, right? It seems like every week there's some new like horrific crime. That most recently, there was the case of I think her first name was Eliza Fletcher, a teacher in Memphis who was killed by a guy who got out early from prison after abducting. Basically, this guy's criminal record stretched back to when I think he was 14, maybe even younger. And these were violent crimes. I think at the age of 14, he raped someone and this also follows like a string of robberies and stuff like that. And ultimately, he ends up in jail. He's supposed to serve 24 years. Under state law, his sentence, because of his prior convictions, he was supposed to serve the full 24. He ended up serving 20 because he managed to shave time off his sentence with good behavior. And 2 years after he was released, he abducted this teacher while she was on her morning run and murdered her,
That's
and
right.
then dumped her body behind an abandoned duplex. And um, what's kind of interesting is, I mean, it's tragic, but there's a kind of cyclicity to this. I believe that 2 weeks after he got out of juvenile detention decades ago, he abducted a lawyer, and actually also in Memphis, and then he went to prison, and then he gets out, and then 2 years after he gets out of prison, he murders his teacher. And it like this is it's a horrific story, because of the brutality of it. And the woman, Fletcher, was, by all accounts, she was like a wonderful mother and wife, and she deeply cared about her students, and she would like make TikToks for them and stuff like that, and like lead like little like sing-alongs, I think during COVID with them and stuff like that. But this happens every day. This happens every single day, and it's always the same story. And you can always count on, suspect had a criminal record.
Yes.
Suspect was recently released from prison.
Yes.
It's always the same thing.
Yes.
But if you say something about it, and especially if you're white, that is almost seems worse, right, than whatever the criminal did.
Right.
You complaining about us having to live like this, it seems like a worse offense. Something that might actually cost you your job and friends.
That's right. And I think that type of coercive, we will smear you if you speak honestly about the problems facing our country and the very real consequences of some of these pro-crime policies, that intimidates even elected politicians who are elected to represent people, to represent the national interest. And so, to me, wrapping up here, the way forward is we need to push the GOP to develop better rhetoric and policies to flip the script, because empowering sociopaths like this longtime criminal in Memphis who went on to rape and kill an innocent person. Empowering sociopaths to hurt people is not virtuous. And you can call it whatever you want. You can call it criminal justice reform. You can call it, cashless bail. You can call it any euphemism that suits your fancy, but we need to be honest about it, cut through the nonsense, and speak to the American people and say, this is not virtuous. Criminals should be in jail. Illegal immigrants should be back in their own country. Like, this is, speak honestly about the nation's problems. And who did this well and did it successfully was President Trump. And I think that is one of the most important lessons we can learn. And there was a time when we were in the White House when President Trump was citing an instance where MS-13 gang members had come into this country and carved up some of the victims with a machete and dismembered them and done some really, really horrific thing. And he referred to them as animals. And the press said, isn't it shocking and disgusting and xenophobic that President Trump would refer to poor, innocent, illegal immigrants who are MS-13 members as animals? How could he do such a thing? And he addressed it directly. He was in a press conference and he said, the press got mad at me because I called MS-13 animals. Well, guess what? I always will. And I think that's the type of, we need some fortitude. We need mental fortitude on the right to speak about these problems honestly. So I want to congratulate you, Pedro. You do a lot of really important work addressing these issues truthfully and digging into some of these important topics. So thank you so much for joining This Is Your Country.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.